Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Brett Davis. Joining me today is the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell. We're going to talk about a story that's headlined "Lawsuit Filed Against Washington's Semi-Automatic Rifle Ban." That refers to House Bill 1240. It's a ban on so-called assault weapons that was assigned by Governor Jay Inslee into law this week. So who or what is litigating and on what basis?
Yeah, so there's actually been two lawsuits, but for this, we're looking at the Firearms Coalition and the Second Amendment Foundation's lawsuit that was filed in the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. And it was filed the moment that Governor Jay Inslee signed the bill on April 25th.
So no lag time, they were just right on it?
Yeah, and I think that this just shows how it's almost like a game of chess where you're already anticipating the opponent's move before they make their move, and then you're just responding. So, and no doubt that they were anticipating a lawsuit anyway. So it's going to be interesting to see how the state tries to defend this, because this is not going to go to a state court. This has been filed in federal court.
I assume that might have something to do down the road with recent Supreme Court decisions on gun rights, the Bruin decision.
Yeah, because they could have filed one in the state courts. Theoretically, they could have done that, but our state Supreme Court would have and on the basis of our, quote unquote, Second Amendment in our state constitution, which is actually more explicit in defining the right to keep and bear arms as an individual right in defense of oneself. But the reason why they would go to the federal court is because the U.S. Supreme Court has issued several rulings that have been very favorable to gun rights advocates. And, the most recent one was the Bruin decision, which overturned a New York state law prohibiting people from carrying firearms outside their homes without a license. And they did what their basis was for whether a state gun control law was allowable is whether it matches the historical regulations and whether the firearm was in common use, and whether the regulatory burden is, justified. And so they said that wasn't the case with the New York state law. So it's going to be interesting to see how Washington state defends its law, because this is a very, very broad definition of an assault weapon and it includes the AR-15, which is one of the most, according to the lawsuit, is one of the most popular firearms in the nation. So for them to argue on the basis of Bruin that is not in common use would be very difficult.
As I was reading through the story, I saw you mention that the lawsuit was based on a couple of constitutional amendments. Obviously, the Second Amendment was one. And what was the other one? The 15th Amendment? Is that correct? Am I remembering that correctly?
The 14th Amendment.
I'm sorry, 14th Amendment. I was one off.
What's going to be also interesting is what I find interesting about this bill is that it all but guaranteed a lawsuit, it's probably going to end up either in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, or it is going to get potentially overturned by a U.S. Supreme Court ruling, because they're still looking at some other gun control laws, like the one in California where they've passed similar legislation. And what this does is it gives the U.S. Supreme Court another stab at ruling on what states can and cannot pass as far as gun control laws. And so they can issue more decisions that could have long-term ramifications for states. Hypothetically, they could just make it very difficult for them to pass any gun control laws at all. They could make it so, this is one possibility. It's, we don't know what the likelihood or probability of it is, but they could just say, certain types of bans are just illegal in all 50 states. So this is where it's going to be interesting to see what the state's strategy is. And there's been some speculation that they know it's going to be overturned, and they're just trying to discourage gun owners from living in the state.
Yes, you answered my anticipated follow-up question. I was going to ask why you think lawmakers proceeded with this, given the climate, the Supreme Court decision and whatnot. It seems almost like an exercise in futility.
One can make the argument that they're doing this just to send a message of people who own these type of weapons are not welcome in the state, and we don't want you here. And kind of basically opening the door to the House and saying, you can close the door on your way out type thing, because they passed a bunch of other legislation as well that's related. One of them requires gun purchasers to complete a background check. That's House Bill 1143. You also have to wait 10 business days after the purchase to take ownership of the firearm. And you also have to show proof of taking a safety training course. Another one, Senate Bill 5078, focuses on the firearm industry and makes them legally liable for gun sales if they don't take what's considered reasonable precautions to ensure that they're not selling guns to people who shouldn't have them. And they also can't market any kind of gun products to minors. So if you are trying to market a gun holster for youth who participate in competition shooting, you can't do that anymore.
Sort of a strange, strange that our gun rights in Washington are stronger than the Second Amendment, but then the legislature went ahead and passed all these gun control measures. So it's almost like two competing ideas. On the one hand, our Constitution is very strong when it comes to individual right to own firearms, but now that the legislature has passed all of these laws, they seem to be going the other way.
Yeah, and it's almost as if the goal is to just get people who own these weapons out of the state, that if that was the objective, then that would make sense why they're passing these bills along with a bunch of other stuff, though. And we're seeing this kind of on the flip side of the coin. At a national level, Washington is kind of an outlier along with California, where other states are loosening their restrictions on gun control. They're allowing permitless concealed carry. They're removing restrictions on firearm purchases. They're at one state, even Montana, is adding or changing an amendment to their constitution to remove a restriction on concealed carry after they've already passed a law allowing it without a permit. So in which, if you're a gun control advocate or you don't like guns in those states, you're going to kind of feel like you are out of place and you'll want to leave. And, places like Washington, California, and New York are bigger on gun control than others. So that could be part of what we're witnessing, is just states sending a message of, these are the kind of people we want in the state, and these are the kind of people we don't want in the state. So that is one other possibility, instead of just looking at straight of them trying to prevent people from getting access to these weapons, because there are already a ton of these guns. Some gun stores have reported 300% increase in sales. So if the intent was to make people not have these, that made it even worse.
At least in the short term, anyway. It looks like we're about to engage in a nationwide de facto experiment on guns in this country. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the various states. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For TJ Martinell, this is Brett Davis. Please subscribe, and thanks so much for listening.